Ranger arrests Poacher, then discovers he's protecting two orphaned bear cubs. The crisp mountain air whipped through the towering pines of the Sequoia National Forest, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Ranger John Riley, a seasoned veteran with a weathered face and kind eyes, trudged through the undergrowth, his loyal dog, Gus, a golden retriever with a perpetually wagging tail, at his side. John had dedicated his life to protecting these woods and the creatures that called them home. He knew every trail, every stream,
Ivia hidden din.
But nothing could have prepared him for the sight that awaited him that day. He had received a call from a distressed hiker who had stumbled upon a heartbreaking scene. A mother bear lay lifeless by the side of the trail, likely the victim of a hit-and-run driver. Two tiny cubs, barely weaned, whimpered beside their mother's body, their cries echoing through the silent forest. John's heart ached at the sight. He knew the cubs wouldn't survive long without their mother. They were too young to hunt, too vulnerable to predators. Gently, he approached the cubs, Gus staying close by, sensing his master's somber mood. The cubs, their fur matted and dirty, looked up at him with fear in their eyes. John knelt down, speaking softly, trying to soothe their fear. He knew he couldn't leave them to die. He had to do something. Carefully, he scooped the cubs into his arms, their tiny bodies trembling. Gus whined softly, licking the cubs' faces in a gesture of comfort. John carried the cubs back to his truck, Gus trotting alongside. He knew he was breaking protocol by taking the cubs, but he couldn't bear the thought of leaving them to their fate. He would figure things out later. Right now, these cubs needed him. Back at his cabin, a small, rustic dwelling nestled deep in the woods, John set up a makeshift den for the cubs in his shed. He warmed milk and fed them with a bottle, marveling at their resilience. Gus, ever the protector, kept watch over the cubs, his tail thumping against the floor whenever they stirred. As the days turned into weeks, John became their surrogate mother. He fed them, cleaned them, and played with them. He named them Hope and Faith, clinging to the hope that they would survive, that he could give them a chance at life. Gus, too, had become their adoptive brother, playing with them, guarding them, and showering them with affection. But John knew this arrangement couldn't last forever. The cubs were getting bigger, stronger. They needed to be in the wild where they belonged. Yet, the thought of releasing them filled him with anxiety. Would they be able to fend for themselves? Would they be safe? One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Gus by his side, John made a promise to himself, a promise to the cubs, and a promise to the memory of their mother. He would do everything in his power to prepare them for life in the wild. He would teach them the skills they needed to survive. He would give them the best chance he could. And when the time was right, he would let them go, with a heavy heart but a hopeful spirit. Life with two bear cubs was anything but dull. Hope and Faith, true to their names, brought a renewed sense of purpose to John's life. His days were filled with the joyful chaos of cub antics. Playful wrestling matches, clumsy attempts at climbing trees, and endless explorations of their surroundings. Gus, ever the patient older brother, tolerated their playful nips and boisterous energy with saintly forbearance. John, however, knew that their idyllic existence couldn't last. He had a duty to prepare these cubs for a life in the wild, a life without him, so he began their education. He taught them to forage for berries and grubs, to identify edible plants, and to distinguish friend from foe in the forest. He showed them how to fish in the nearby stream, their clumsy paws swatting at the water with adorable ineptitude. Gus, a natural-born retriever, demonstrated the art of fishing with effortless grace, much to the cubs' admiration. John also instilled in them a healthy respect for the dangers of the wild. He taught them to avoid human contact, to recognize the signs of danger, and to defend themselves when necessary. He even staged mock attacks using his old ranger hat as a prop to teach them how to react in a threatening situation. Gus, ever vigilant, would bark encouragingly from the sidelines, adding a touch of realism to the training exercises. As the cubs grew, so did their confidence and their skills. They became adept at climbing trees, their claws finding purchase on the rough bark with ease. They learned to hunt small rodents, their instincts kicking in with surprising ferocity. And they developed a deep bond with each other, their sibling rivalry tempered by an unwavering loyalty. One day, while on a foraging expedition, they encountered a porcupine, its quills bristling in warning. Hope, ever the bold one, approached the prickly creature with curiosity. John held his breath, ready to intervene, but Faith, the more cautious of the two, pulled her sister back, a low growl rumbling in her throat. John felt a surge of pride. They were learning, adapting, surviving. But with their growing independence came a growing sense of apprehension in John's heart. The time to release them was approaching, and the thought of saying goodbye filled him with a bittersweet mixture of pride and sadness. He had grown to love these cubs as if they were his own, and the prospect of losing them left a gaping hole in his heart. Gus, too, seemed to sense the impending separation. He spent more and more time with the cubs, his playful demeanor replaced by a quiet protectiveness. He would often lie beside them, his head resting on their furry backs, as if trying to imprint their scent in his memory. John knew he couldn't postpone the inevitable any longer. He had to let them go. It was time for Hope and Faith to fulfill their destiny, to become the wild bears they were meant to be. But he would never forget them, and he knew deep down that they would never forget him either. The day of the release arrived, heavy with emotion. John had chosen a remote area of the forest, far from human settlements, a place where the cubs could thrive undisturbed. He loaded Hope and Faith into the back of his truck, their familiar den now lined with fresh leaves and berries. Gus sat beside them, his head resting on Hope's back, a low whine escaping his throat. The drive was a somber one. John's mind raced with memories of the past months. The sleepless nights, the endless feedings, the playful antics, the shared moments of joy and anxiety. He had poured his heart and soul into these cubs, and now he was about to let them go. He reached the designated spot, a clearing bathed in the soft light of the morning sun. With a heavy heart, he opened the truck's back door. Hope and Faith hesitated for a moment, their eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Then, with a burst of energy, they bounded out of the truck, their noses twitching, their senses alive with the smells and sounds of the forest. Gus followed them, barking playfully, urging them to explore their new home. They frolicked in the clearing, chasing butterflies, sniffing at tree trunks, and tumbling over each other in a joyous reunion with their natural habitat. John watched them, a lump forming in his throat. He knew this was the right thing to do, but it didn't make it any easier. He called Gus back to the truck, and the dog obeyed, casting a longing glance back at the cubs. John knelt down, wrapping his arms around Gus's neck. "They'll be all right, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They're home now." As he drove away, he couldn't help but look back one last time. The cubs were standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him go. He raised his hand in a silent farewell, a tear rolling down his cheek. He knew he would never forget them. Back at his cabin, the silence was deafening. The empty shed, the lingering scent of bear cubs, the absence of playful growls and happy squeaks, it all served as a constant reminder of his loss. Gus, too, seemed lost and forlorn. He wandered around the cabin, sniffing at the cubs' empty den, his tail drooping. John tried to distract himself with his ranger duties, but his heart wasn't in it. He found himself constantly scanning the forest, hoping for a glimpse of the cubs, yearning for a sign that they were okay. He knew it was irrational, but he couldn't help it. He had grown too attached to them. One evening, as he sat on his porch, lost in thought, Gus suddenly perked up, his ears pricked, his body tense. He let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the edge of the woods. John followed his gaze, his heart pounding. And then he saw them. Hope and Faith emerged from the trees, their fur sleek and healthy, their eyes shining with confidence. They had grown, matured, become true wild bears. But as they approached the cabin, Their familiar grunts and playful nudges against Gus told John that they hadn't forgotten him. They hadn't forgotten their human friend, the one who had given them a second chance at life. The reunion was a joyous one, albeit tinged with a hint of caution. Hope and Faith, though clearly comfortable in John's presence, were no longer the helpless cubs he had rescued. They were wild animals now, with instincts and behaviors that John respected. He kept a safe distance, allowing them to approach him on their own terms. Gus, however, had no such reservations. He greeted the cubs with unrestrained enthusiasm, licking their faces, playfully nipping at their ears, and engaging them in a boisterous game of chase. The cubs responded in kind, their deep growls and playful swats a testament to their affection for their canine companion. John watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. He had feared that the cubs would forget him, that their wild instincts would override any bond they had formed with him. But their return, their obvious affection for him and Gus, proved him wrong. The bond they had forged was stronger than he had imagined. Over the next few weeks, Hope and Faith became regular visitors to the cabin. They would appear at dawn, their presence announced by Gus's excited barks, and spend the day playing in the clearing, foraging for food, and basking in the sun. John would often join them, sitting on the porch, observing them, marveling at their grace and power. He learned to read their moods, to understand their subtle cues. He knew when they were playful, when they were hungry, when they were feeling threatened. He even learned to communicate with them, using a combination of hand gestures, vocalizations, and body language. One day, a group of hikers stumbled upon the cabin, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear at the sight of the bears. John, sensing their apprehension, calmly explained the situation, assuring them that the bears were friendly and posed no threat. He even invited the hikers to join him on the porch, where they watched in awe as Hope and Faith played with Gus. The hikers left with a newfound appreciation for bears, their fear replaced by wonder. John realized then that Hope and Faith had become ambassadors of sorts, bridging the gap between humans and the wild, fostering understanding and respect. But their peaceful existence was soon to be shattered. A new threat emerged, one that would test the bonds of friendship and loyalty, and push John to his limits. Poacher, notorious for his ruthlessness and disregard for wildlife, had set his sights on the Sequoia National Forest, and Hope and Faith were his prime targets. A chill wind swept through the forest, carrying with it a sense of unease. John, ever attuned to the rhythms of the wilderness, felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle discordance that set his nerves on edge. He had heard whispers in the nearby town of a poacher, a man named Jake the Shadow Malone, who had been seen lurking in the area. Malone was a notorious figure, known for his ruthlessness and his disdain for wildlife regulations. He hunted for profit, selling bear pelts and other animal parts on the black market. John's heart sank as he realized the danger that Hope and Faith were in. They were no longer just vulnerable cubs. They were valuable commodities in the eyes of a man like Malone. He knew he had to protect them, but how? He was just one man, and Malone was a seasoned hunter, cunning and ruthless. He decided to warn the cubs, to urge them to stay away from the cabin, to seek refuge in the deepest parts of the forest. But as he approached their usual meeting spot, he was met with a scene that made his blood run cold. Malone was there, his rifle glinting in the sunlight, his eyes fixed on Hope and Faith, who were cornered against a towering redwood. John's mind raced. He had to act fast, but he couldn't risk the cubs' safety. He reached for his own rifle, a relic from his days in the military, but he knew that a shootout would only endanger the bears further. He had to find another way. Gus, sensing the danger, let out a low growl, his hackles raised. John, in a desperate gamble, whispered a command. "Distract him, boy!" Gus, ever loyal, launched himself at Malone, barking furiously, his teeth bared. Malone, startled by the sudden attack, stumbled backward, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air. Hope and Faith, seizing the opportunity, bolted into the dense undergrowth, disappearing from sight. John, using the distraction to his advantage, tackled Malone to the ground, a fierce struggle ensuing. Malone was a strong man, fueled by desperation and greed, but John was driven by a primal urge to protect, to defend those he loved. The fight was brutal, a desperate clash of wills amidst the serene backdrop of the forest. John, despite his age, was no stranger to combat, his years as a ranger having honed his instincts and his strength. He managed to wrestle the rifle away from Malone, but the poacher fought back with a ferocity that surprised him. Just as Malone gained the upper hand, pinning John to the ground, a blur of fur and claws erupted from the bushes. Hope and faith, their protective instincts triggered, launched themselves at Malone, their powerful paws raking his back, their growls echoing through the forest. Malone, overwhelmed by the sudden assault, cried out in pain and surprise. He scrambled to his feet, his face contorted in fear, and fled into the woods, the bears in hot pursuit. John, bruised and breathless, watched them go, a wave of relief washing over him. He had won, but at a cost. He had exposed the cubs to danger, had forced them to confront the dark side of humanity. He prayed that this encounter wouldn't scar them, that they wouldn't lose their trust in humans. Gus, panting heavily, nuzzled against John, his tail wagging weakly. John wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in his fur. "Good boy, Gus," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." As the adrenaline subsided, John realized the gravity of the situation. Malone was still out there, wounded but dangerous. He had to report the incident to the authorities. But he also knew that Malone would be back, seeking revenge. He had to be prepared. He had to protect hope and faith no matter the cost. The incident with Malone cast a long shadow over the tranquility of the forest. John, despite his relief at the cubs' escape, was haunted by the knowledge that the poacher was still out there, lurking in the shadows, a threat to the very creatures he had sworn to protect. He reported the encounter to the local authorities, but they were skeptical. Their resources stretched thin, their priorities focused on more pressing matters. John knew he couldn't rely on the authorities alone. He had to take matters into his own hands. He spent his days patrolling the forest, his senses heightened, his rifle always within reach. Gus, ever vigilant, accompanied him on his patrols, his keen senses and unwavering loyalty a constant source of comfort. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent a jolt of anxiety through John's body. He imagined Malone hiding behind every tree, his rifle aimed, his eyes filled with malice. He knew he was being paranoid, but he couldn't shake the feeling that danger was lurking around every corner. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, John spotted a flicker of movement in the distance. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly, and focused on the figure. It was Malone, his face grimy, his clothes torn, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and desperation. John's instincts screamed at him to confront the poacher, to bring him to justice. But he hesitated. He knew that a direct confrontation would only put himself and the cubs at risk. He needed a plan, a way to capture Malone without endangering anyone. He decided to follow Malone, to track him to his hideout, to gather evidence of his illegal activities. He signaled to Gus, and the dog, understanding the silent command, fell into step beside him, his senses alert, his muscles coiled. They followed Malone for hours, their pursuit leading them deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The terrain became treacherous, the undergrowth thick and thorny, but John pressed on, his determination fueled by a sense of duty and a fierce protectiveness towards the cubs. Finally, as the moon rose high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest, they reached Malone's hideout, a dilapidated cabin hidden in a secluded clearing. John, careful not to alert the poacher, circled the cabin, observing his surroundings. He noticed a shed behind the cabin, its door slightly ajar. He crept towards the shed, Gus at his heels, his senses heightened. He peered inside the shed, his heart sinking as he saw what lay within. Piles of animal pelts, bear traps, and other poaching equipment were scattered across the floor. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. John felt a surge of anger and disgust. This man was a menace, a blight on the natural world. He decided to wait until morning, to catch Malone red-handed, to gather irrefutable evidence of his crimes. He and Gus settled down in the undergrowth, their bodies weary, their minds alert. The night was long and tense, filled with the sounds of the forest and the gnawing anxiety of the impending confrontation. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the canopy, John saw Malone emerge from the cabin, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the surroundings. John knew this was his chance. He sprang from his hiding place, his rifle raised, his voice ringing out through the stillness of the morning. "Malone, you're under arrest." Malone whirled around, his eyes widening in shock and disbelief. He raised his rifle, but John was faster. He fired a warning shot, the bullet whizzing past Malone's ear, embedding itself in the trunk of a nearby tree. Malone, his bravado crumbling, dropped his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. Gus, sensing the shift in power, moved forward, barking menacingly, his teeth bared. Malone cowered, his face pale, his body trembling. John approached cautiously, his rifle still trained on the poacher. "Don't move, Malone," John commanded, his voice firm and unwavering. "You're under arrest for poaching and illegal possession of firearms." Malone, defeated and demoralized, offered no resistance. John handcuffed him, his movements swift and efficient. He then contacted the authorities, reporting his capture and requesting backup. As they waited for the authorities to arrive, John couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had brought a dangerous criminal to justice, had protected the forest and its inhabitants from further harm. But he also felt a pang of sadness. Malone, for all his flaws, was a product of a system that valued profit over preservation, a system that often turned a blind eye to the exploitation of nature. When the authorities arrived, they were initially skeptical of John's story, but the evidence was undeniable. The poaching equipment, the animal pelts, Malone's own confession. He was arrested and taken away, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. The news of Malone's capture spread through the community like wildfire. John was hailed as a hero, his actions praised by conservationists and locals alike. He received letters of gratitude from people all over the country, thanking him for his bravery and his dedication to protecting wildlife. But for John, the greatest reward was the return of peace to the forest. Hope and faith, sensing the absence of danger, resumed their visits to the cabin, their playful antics and affectionate nudges a balm to John's soul. Gus, too, seemed lighter, his playful demeanor restored, his tail wagging with renewed vigor. The incident with Malone had left its mark, but it had also strengthened the bonds between John, Gus, and the cubs. They had faced adversity together, had overcome danger together, and had emerged stronger and more united than ever. John knew that the threat to wildlife would never truly disappear. There would always be those who sought to exploit nature for their own gain. But he also knew that there would always be those who stood in defense of the wild, who fought to protect the creatures that shared this planet with us. And he, along with Gus and the cubs, would be among them. Life at the cabin settled into a comfortable routine. The days were filled with the familiar rhythms of nature, the rising and setting of the sun, the changing seasons, the ebb and flow of wildlife. John, his heart lighter, his spirit renewed, embraced the tranquility of his surroundings. Hope and faith continued their regular visits, their presence a constant source of joy and wonder. They had grown into magnificent creatures, their fur sleek and glossy, their movements graceful and powerful. They were no longer the helpless cubs he had rescued. They were wild bears, masters of their domain. But despite their wildness, they retained a special bond with John and Gus. They would often spend hours playing in the clearing, their playful growls and mock fights echoing through the forest. Gus, ever the playful companion, would join in their games, his barks and playful nips a testament to their enduring friendship. One day, John noticed a change in Hope's behavior. She seemed restless, her movements agitated, her eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. John, concerned, observed her closely, trying to decipher her signals. He soon realized that she was pregnant. The news filled him with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He knew that Hope would make a wonderful mother, but he also knew that the challenges of raising cubs in the wild were immense. He worried about her safety, about the safety of her unborn cubs. He decided to keep a closer watch on Hope, following her discreetly on her foraging expeditions, ensuring that she was healthy and well-fed. He also prepared a secluded den near the cabin, a safe haven where she could give birth and raise her cubs. When the time came, Hope retreated to the den, her instincts guiding her. John, respecting her need for privacy, kept his distance, but he remained vigilant, ensuring that she was undisturbed. A few weeks later, the forest echoed with the cries of newborn cubs. John, his heart swelling with joy, crept closer to the den, careful not to disturb the new family. He peered inside, his eyes widening in wonder. Hope lay nestled amongst a pile of leaves, her 3 tiny cubs suckling at her breast. He watched them for hours, marveling at the miracle of life, the resilience of nature. He knew that these cubs represented a new generation, a symbol of hope for the future of the forest. He also knew that he had played a small part in their existence, that his actions had helped to ensure their survival. He had risked everything to save Hope and Faith, and now, their cubs were a testament to his compassion and his dedication. As the cubs grew, they ventured out of the den, their playful antics filling the forest with life. John watched them with pride, his heart filled with a sense of fulfillment. He had come full circle, from rescuing orphaned cubs to witnessing the birth of a new generation. He knew that his time in the forest was drawing to a close. He was getting older, his body weary, his spirit yearning for rest. But he also knew that he would leave behind a legacy of love, compassion, and unwavering dedication to the wild. The years passed, each season etching its mark on John's face and frame. His hair turned silver, his steps slowed, but his eyes retained their youthful sparkle, reflecting a life well lived, a heart full of love for the wilderness. Hope and Faith, now matriarchs of their own families, continued to visit, bringing their cubs to meet the man who had saved their mothers. John would watch the young cubs frolic in the clearing, their playful energy a reminder of his own youthful days. He saw in them the future of the forest, a future he had helped to secure. Gus, his loyal companion, aged alongside John. His once golden fur turned white, his gait slowed, but his spirit remained indomitable. He would still greet the bears with a wagging tail and a playful bark, his love for them undiminished by time. One day, John received a visitor, a young woman named Sarah, a park ranger newly assigned to the Sequoia National Forest. Sarah was eager and enthusiastic, her eyes filled with a passion for nature that reminded John of his younger self. He took her under his wing, sharing his knowledge of the forest, his experiences with the bears, his philosophy of conservation. Sarah listened intently, her admiration for John growing with each passing day. She saw in him a mentor, a role model, a guardian of the wilderness. John, sensing her dedication, decided to entrust her with his legacy. He told her the story of Hope and Faith, of their rescue, their release, their enduring bond. He showed her the secluded den where Hope had raised her cubs, the clearing where they played, the trails they frequented. Sarah was captivated by the story, her heart touched by the depth of connection between John and the bears. She vowed to continue his work, to protect the forest and its inhabitants with the same passion and dedication. John, reassured by Sarah's commitment, felt a sense of peace. He knew that his legacy was in good hands, that the future of the forest was secure. He had found a worthy successor, someone who would carry on his work, someone who would cherish the wilderness as he had. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the forest, John and Sarah sat on the porch, watching the bears play in the clearing. Gus lay at their feet, his head resting on John's lap, his breathing slow and steady. "The forest is in good hands now, Sarah," John said, his voice soft but firm. "Remember, it's not just about protecting the animals. It's about protecting the balance, the harmony, the spirit of the wild." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I won't let you down, John," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "I promise." John smiled, a sense of contentment washing over him. He had done all he could. He had lived a full life, a life dedicated to the wilderness, a life enriched by the love of a loyal dog and the enduring bond with two extraordinary bears. He was ready to rest, to let the forest embrace him, to become one with the wilderness he had cherished for so long. Winter descended upon the Sequoia National Forest, blanketing the landscape in a pristine white shroud. The air grew crisp, the days shortened, and a hush fell over the land, as if nature itself was holding its breath. John, his body weakened by age, felt the chill seep into his bones. He spent most of his days by the fire, wrapped in a warm blanket, Gus curled up at his feet. Sarah visited often, bringing him food and supplies, her presence a comforting warmth in the midst of the winter's chill. Hope and faith, their coats thick and luxurious, made their occasional visits, their cubs frolicking in the snow, their playful antics a welcome distraction from the encroaching winter. John watched them from the window, a smile gracing his lips. He knew that they would be fine, that they would carry on, that the cycle of life would continue. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside, John felt a weariness he had never known before. He called Sarah, his voice weak but steady. "It's time, Sarah," he said. "I'm ready." Sarah arrived quickly, her eyes filled with tears, but her heart strong. She sat by his bedside, holding his hand, offering comfort and solace. Gus, sensing the gravity of the moment, whined softly, his head resting on John's arm. John looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah," he whispered. "You've been a true friend." He then turned his gaze to Gus, his loyal companion, his furry confidant. "You've been the best dog a man could ask for, Gus," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll miss you, boy." Gus licked his hand, his tail thumping weakly against the bed. John closed his eyes, a peaceful smile gracing his lips. He took one last breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, the scent of the forest he had loved so dearly. And then he was gone. Sarah, her heart heavy with grief, closed his eyes and gently laid his hands across his chest. Gus whined softly, nuzzling his head against John's lifeless hand. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, a silent witness to the passing of a remarkable man. The next morning, Sarah buried John in a clearing overlooking the valley, a place where he had often sat, contemplating the beauty of the wilderness. She placed a simple wooden cross on his grave, inscribed with the words, "Guardian of the Forest." As she stood by his grave, a sense of peace descended upon her. She knew that John was at rest, his spirit reunited with the wilderness he had cherished. She looked up at the sky, the sun breaking through the clouds, casting a golden light on the snow-covered landscape. She knew that John's legacy would live on, that his love for the forest would continue to inspire generations to come. And as she turned to leave, she saw them. Hope and Faith stood at the edge of the clearing, their cubs by their side, their heads bowed in silent tribute. They had come to say goodbye to their human friend, the man who had risked everything to save them, the man who had taught them the meaning of love and compassion. Sarah watched them, tears streaming down her face, but her heart filled with hope. The circle of life continued, the forest thrived, and John's spirit lived on in the rustling leaves, the whispering pines, and the enduring bond between humans and animals.